The fog lay thick across the Seine, smothering the lamps along the quays until they glowed like blurred halos, as if the city itself were caught in a dream. Somewhere behind the mist, the slow hum of a barge's engine reverberated against the embankments, and the faint clatter of horse hooves struck a rhythm on the cobbles. At such hours, Paris seemed both eternal and fragile, suspended between silence and menace, and it was in this uncertain hour that Maigret found himself once again listening to the pulse of the city, as if the stones themselves whispered of the crime that had unsettled Rue des Martyrs. No one had seen the tenant, or perhaps no one cared to admit what they had glimpsed, yet his presence was felt in every creak of the stairwell, in every draught that unsettled the lace curtains of the concierge's lodge. The silence was not absence, it was insistence, a silence heavy enough to raise suspicion in even the most indifferent passer-by. Those who find themselves wandering with us tonight into this world of shadows, of cigarette smoke curling in dimly lit cafes, of telegrams sliding under closed office doors, I invite you to linger a while. Let yourself be drawn into Maigret's slow, patient stride, into the warmth of his pipe, into the troubling spaces where men and women hide more than they confess. If this atmosphere stirs something in you, if the rhythm of this unfolding story pulls you closer, then take a moment to stay with us. Subscribe, share, leave behind a trace of your presence, much like the solitary tenant whose silence has become the seed of mystery. For stories such as these, once they begin, ask not merely to be read or watched, but to be lived. Now let us open the case as if unsealing a forgotten envelope and trace its path chapter by chapter, each bearing the weight of suspicion, each leading us deeper into the alleys of truth and rumour alike. The fog pressed close against the facades of Rue des Martyrs, as if the street itself wished to be erased from the city's memory. A gas lamp, trembling in its glass casing, barely reached the slick cobblestones, and the outlines of shuttered shops leaned into one another like old conspirators whispering behind a veil. There were footsteps now and then, hurried, muffled, swallowed by mist before one could guess their owner. It was the sort of evening when Paris seemed to fold in upon itself, leaving each street to its private unease. Maigret stood for a moment at the corner, collar raised against the damp. The stem of his pipe clenched between his teeth. The tobacco had gone out, but he had not yet the will to strike another match. He preferred the weight of silence, the slow pacing of thought that gathered when he let the city breathe around him. The street had nothing to distinguish it at first glance. Modest shops, bakers, a cobbler, a shuttered grocer's, lined the lower floors, and above them stretched a series of narrow windows, most curtained, a few showing dim, rectangles of light. Yet there was something in the air, a tension that clung as stubbornly as the fog. Tenants had spoken of a man, elusive, withdrawn, occupying a room near the top of a building where the plaster cracked around the cornices. No one saw him regularly. Some claimed he left early, returning long after midnight. Others insisted he had been absent for weeks, though the concierge swore she still heard faint movements on the stair. Silence is rarely neutral in a Parisian building. It grows into suspicion, into rumour, into the kind of restlessness that eventually seeps out into the street. Maigret's heavy frame shifted as he moved toward the doorway of number 72, where a yellow bulb buzzed behind wire mesh. He pressed the bell, though it was unnecessary. The concierge had been waiting, head wrapped in a woolen shawl, eyes sharp despite the dimness. She opened the door not with warmth, but with a measured caution, as though admitting not a police commissioner, but a draft she wished to keep out. "You've come," she said, her voice dry as paper. "I didn't know if anyone would take notice." Maigret inclined his head, neither confirming nor denying. He had learned long ago that words, offered too soon, tangled the thread of truth. He followed her into the narrow lodge that smelled of cabbage soup and floor polish, the kind of odour that clung to every such dwelling across Paris. On a shelf sat a small clock, ticking with exaggerated patience. He lowered himself onto a hard chair, knees bent at awkward angles, and waited. The woman's hands fussed with her shawl, though she had no need of its warmth. Her eyes darted upward, toward the ceiling. "He never speaks," she murmured. "Not to me, not to the others. Pays his rent, always late, always in cash. A shadow on the stair, that's what he is. Some tenants prefer shadows, but this one weighs on the house." Maigret struck a match at last, cupping the flame with his large hand until his pipe caught. He drew in the smoke, letting it fill his lungs, his eyes half-lidded with the pleasure of the ritual. The words came slowly, gravel-soft. "And tonight?" The concierge's shoulders lifted, a jerky motion of unease. "Tonight, nothing again, no sound. The neighbours whisper. They come to me with questions as if I could tell them what silence means. A man's silence is his own, is it not? But when it lasts too long, the walls complain." Upstairs, the staircase wound into dimness, lit only by a single bulb at each landing, their filaments buzzing like angry insects. Maigret's steps were measured, heavy, yet unhurried, the soles of his shoes resonating against the wooden treads. Each landing carried the smell of lives, stacked one upon another, frying onions, damp laundry, stale tobacco. The tenant's door was on the 4th floor, painted a brown so dull it had sunk into obscurity. He paused, studying its surface, the scratches near the lock, the faint scuff, marks where boots had lingered. He placed his hand against the wood, cold, still. He listened. No sound, no rustle, not even the settling of furniture. It was possible the man had left. It was possible he had never been there at all, that the entire figure existed only as a construct of rumour and dread. Yet Maigret knew better. Silence, too, has its shape, its presence, and he felt it now pressing against the door as palpably as if someone was seated inside, listening, with bated breath. He did not knock, not yet. He descended again, pipe smoke trailing like a banner. The concierge watched him return, her face caught between expectation and fear. He asked nothing further, merely nodded once and stepped back into the night. Rue des Martyrs had grown quieter still. A cat slipped across the cobbles, tail low, eyes reflecting the gaslight like fragments of broken glass. A man in a bowler hat passed, head down, his coat collar upturned, hurrying away from the fog as though it might cling to his lungs. Maigret stood a long while, filling his pipe again, his gaze moving from shutter to shutter, from shadow to shadow. The street seemed to wait with him, as if it too knew that behind one of those walls the truth lay dormant, resistant, patient as the fog itself. What was a tenant, after all? To most of Paris, it meant a stranger who paid his rent and kept his affairs to himself. But to Maigret it meant a thread woven into the fabric of the street, a presence that altered the weight of every passing glance, every whispered conversation. When that thread grew too tight or too loose, the whole fabric shifted. And here, on Rue des Martyrs, the fabric had twisted just enough to draw him from the warmth of Quai des Orfèvres, pipe in pocket, hat pulled low. The night deepened. Somewhere a piano faltered, its notes drifting from a tavern half a street away. The tune was clumsy, but the melancholy hung in the fog like a reminder that life, no matter how ordinary, carried its own tragedies. Maigret's breath clouded before him, then dissolved. He thought of Madame Maigret waiting at home with the lamp lit, a novel unopened in her lap, the quiet patience of a woman accustomed to her husband's absences. He would not return soon, he knew it already. The street had gripped him, and he could no more leave it than the fog could abandon the river. Above, behind that dull brown door, silence continued its vigil, and Maigret, pipe glowing faintly, accepted that he was already ensnared by the mystery of a man who spoke nothing, left no trace, yet had managed to disturb an entire house into sleepless suspicion. The fog of Rue des Martyrs was not just in the air, it was in the hearts of its tenants, and now, in the commissioner's thoughts. Morning came without brightness, a dull light filtered through a sky the colour of ash, and the fog, unwilling to surrender, had only thinned enough to reveal the street's fatigue. Rue des Martyrs woke grudgingly, as if the shutters themselves needed coaxing to open. A delivery cart clattered over the cobbles, the horse's breath plume-like in the chill, and somewhere a boy cried the headlines in a voice too young for the misery it carried. Maigret stood again before number 72 with the implacable posture of a man who intends to wait the truth into existence. The concierge's lodge door was ajar. He rapped lightly, then entered, stooping his head by habit, though the lintel did not require it. The lodge had the neatness of a soldier's footlocker, every object in its place, the bed smoothed into perfect obedience, a pot steaming faintly on the cooker. The concierge sat at a table covered by oilcloth printed with faded violets, her hands wrapped around a cup of chicory coffee, the heat rising in thin ribbons. She lifted her eyes to him without surprise. He imagined she had been listening for his step ever since dawn began to lift itself from the roofs. "You smoke early?" she said, a sardonic twitch at the corner of her mouth as she glanced at his pipe. "I smoke when there is air for it," he replied, not unkindly, and set his hat on the vacant chair as if to assure her he would not rush her. "Last night you said the walls complain when silence lasts too long. Tell me how they complain." The concierge shifted, the shawl tight around her shoulders, though the lodge was warm. She possessed that Parisian gift of turning statements into enigmas, and her eyes, lively and shrewd, made him think of needlework, small movements that produced a pattern if one had patience to watch. She sipped, then placed the cup down with care. "It is the way footsteps cease to speak. At first there is the regularity of a man's routine. He comes in, he climbs, he pauses before his door, the keys jingle. After a time, even if you can't see him, you learn the language of his feet, then it changes or it vanishes, and the house, well, it holds its breath. You hear all this from the lodge? I hear what I must. It is my work." Her pride in the word work was a stiff little thing, resistant to pity. He arrived 2 months ago, perhaps 3. He gave no name beyond Monsieur Duval, which might as well be Monsieur Anyone. He had a small valise and a larger suitcase, scuffed and light as if empty. He paid for a month in advance, but always as though he regretted parting with the coins. He spoke little. When I asked for papers, he told me he had mislaid them. I didn't insist. "And you regret that?" "I regret nothing," she snapped, with that peculiarly Parisian contradiction that meant she regretted profoundly. The sharpness faded as soon as it appeared. "He is or was polite." But his politeness had no warmth, like water left overnight. He looked at people as if he could see through them, but without curiosity. No, that's not it. As if he were calculating which part of a person mattered and discarding the rest. What time did his day belong to? Nights more than days. He went out after dusk, returned after midnight. He never brought anyone. He never asked for messages. He never received letters. No letters at all? Only once. A postcard, provincial stamp, the picture of a church. Romanesque, I think. He took it without a word, slipped it into his coat. I watched the day's refuse carefully after that. No postcard torn, no scraps with writing. He kept it. His pipe made a small sound as he drew, the ember brightening and then fading to a coal. He said nothing for a time, studying the woman's hands, the dry skin webbed with pale lines, hands accustomed to cold stair rails and heavy buckets. She was a dependable narrator, but all such narrators selected their facts the way a house selects its drafts. "You spoke of keys," he said at last. "How many?" "One key to the door, one to the letterbox." He never lost them. He never asked me for a duplicate. Sometimes in the very late hour I heard a faint scrape, as if he turned the keys slowly to avoid waking the house. "Did you ever see his room?" Her lips pressed together. "No. It is not our custom to intrude unless the rent fails, or the smell demands it. The rent did not fail. The smell—" She paused as if scent were an accusation. Sometimes there was kerosene, sometimes the trace of cold tobacco. Once, very faintly, I thought I detected a medicinal odour. Not ether exactly, something bitter. "You have tenants who complain?" "Tenants always complain. It is their second rent." She glanced toward the stairwell beyond which the building climbed in a spine of worn wood and iron rails. Madame Ferrand on the third says he watched her through the banister when she polished the steps. She is vain and lives in hope of an audience, so I discount it. Monsieur Baraduc on the second says the man never greeted him, not even once. That I believe. The little seamstress under the eaves, Clémence, says she heard him humming one night, a tune she couldn't place. I asked her to hum it back to me, but she could only shake her head and say it had no melody, only persistence. Maigret let the weight of these fragments settle, the way one waits for silt to fall in a jar of muddy water. He stood, filled his chest with the damp air of the stairwell, and began to climb. The concierge followed at a distance, her slippers flattening themselves on each step, as if fearful of making a remark. On the first landing, the door to the cobbler's flat stood ajar, the scent of leather and glue like a low, steady bass note. A dark-haired man in shirt-sleeves glanced out and then back in, uninterested in police or mystery. People learn to be uninterested when interest costs more than it pays. On the second floor, a door clicked shut just as they passed. On the third, Madame Ferrand peered through the crack of her spy-hole with the theatrical caution of a woman who wishes to be discovered. At last they reached the fourth, and there it was, the brown door with its weary paint, the lock set slightly crooked, the threshold marked by a scuff that might have been the trace of someone who hesitated, foot poised between entrance and retreat. Maigret bent, the better to inspect the keyhole. A tiny crescent of dust had formed beneath the knob, as if unsettled by recent motion. He straightened and listened, his face expressionless. The concierge's breath behind him was quick, then steady, the sound of a bird that decides not to fly. He knocked, knuckles soft, as if greeting an old acquaintance whose nerves were easily startled. No answer. He knocked again, sharper. Nothing. "Do you have a pass key?" The concierge produced one from the depths of her skirt pocket, attached to a chain of safety pins, a bottle opener, and a tiny St. Anthony medal dulled by years of fingers. She held the key as if it might burn her, and waited for him to take it. He turned the lock slowly, meeting the resistance of a mechanism that had not been oiled for a season. The door opened inward with the reluctant thud of wood that knows itself an accomplice to secrecy. The room was small, bare in the way that rooms become when their owner keeps his life folded tight. A bed with a metal frame made a thin rectangle against the wall. The coverlet was smoothed, but indifferent, the colour of weak tea. A washstand held a cracked basin, and a bar of soap, pared thin. The window faced the courtyard, where a strip of pale sky lay like a damp bandage above roofs that wept in the morning air. On the small table, a lamp with a kerosene reservoir stood beside a book, whose spine had been broken and mended with string. A chair, the plainest possible, bore the marks of weight and worry. Maigret stepped inside without touching anything. He had long ago learned to begin with the air. Rooms speak first by their breath. This one was not rank, as a void often is when a man disappears. It was neither fresh nor stale, but suspended, as if its inhabitant had stepped out and intended to return before the tea cooled. He moved toward the table. The book, he saw, was a railway timetable, dog-eared, its pages creased at the sections for lines stretching toward the north. Folding between two pages, like a pressed leaf, was a receipt from a café. He read the name, Le Perroquet Bleu, and set it down as unremarkably as he had picked it up. The washstand yielded a razor, inexpensive, wiped with conscientiousness. A shaving brush with a few bristles splayed outward lay beside it, a small tuft of soap clinging like frost. On the floor beneath the bed, almost shyly placed, was the larger suitcase the concierge had described. He drew it out. The handle protested, then surrendered. Inside, neatly arranged, were shirts more threadbare than poor, a knitted scarf of the sort mothers send from the provinces, a pair of socks darned at the heel with cross-hatched care, and, in a folded envelope, 5 train tickets, unused, each to a different small station whose names would be unremarkable except for the sense that they were arranged not as destinations, but as hesitations. He looked at the dates. Recent enough to make the room feel watched. On the windowsill, turned toward the glass, a small photograph stood. It had been placed not to be seen, but to be near the light. He lifted it and saw a woman seated on a bench before a provincial church, her hands in her lap, looking at the lens as one looks at an auditor, neither warmly nor coldly, only with measured acceptance. The back of the photograph bore a smudged stamp from a photographer's shop he did not know, no inscription. The woman's expression was the sort that made the heart want to furnish her a story so that her silence would be less austere. He set the photograph down face up now and looked for the postcard the concierge had mentioned. He found no card on the dresser, none in the drawer, none under the mattress. He did, however, discover a square indentation on the table's surface where a card might have rested for weeks, creating a faint outline in dust like a missed appointment. Someone had removed it recently, perhaps the tenant, perhaps another. The lock, though stiff, had not been forced. The window latch bore no scratch of intrusion. He stood very still. In stillness, the small details came forward like fish near the surface. The floorboards gave that delicate hint of betrayal when a heavy weight has stood too long in a single spot. He followed the complaint to the corner where a trunk would have fitted, though no trunk was present. Another absence, this one older. On the chair he noticed a coat folded with the tidy severity of a man who folds rather than drapes. Inside the pocket he found a square of paper worn at the edges. It was a claim cheque from the left luggage office at Gare du Nord, dated a week prior. He held it in his palm, feeling the faint grease of human passage. Behind him, the concierge shifted, her shoes murmuring on the floor. "I have never been in this room," she whispered, as if she needed absolution. "You have been here many times," he said, not unkindly. "In your thoughts." She made a tiny sound that might have been a laugh. He pictured her at her lodge, imagining what lay behind this door, as if it were a theatre to which she owned the key but never the ticket. He asked her to wait outside. She hesitated, then obeyed, her retreating step a relief to the room, which seemed to draw its breath again once she had gone. He remained alone and let the silence wash over him, the way one stands on a riverbank to sense the current rather than see it. A timetable, a cafe receipt, 5 unused tickets, a claim check, a photograph turned away. Each object was modest, content in itself, yet together they had the unmistakable geometry of intention. Men who drift do not keep timetables close. Men who run do not leave 5 doors open at once. Men who hide sometimes place a woman near the light and stare at her when no one else is watching. He left the room as he had found it, with only the angle of the photograph altered, an offence he knew the tenant would detect if the tenant returned. In the stairwell he paused to tamp his pipe, the bowl cupped in his palm. The concierge peered up at him like a sparrow, ready to interpret his features as salvation or threat. "Well?" she asked. "There is a café he favours," he replied. "Le Perroquet Bleu. Do you know it?" She sniffed, a sound like a drawer closing. "On the corner, near the tram stop. They water the wine." "They water many things in Paris," he said. "I will pay them a visit." He replaced his hat, the brim setting his face into its habitual shadow. "If he returns, he will see the room has had an eye inside it. He may not return, or he may come to test whether he has been seen. At such times the house must not show its alarm." She straightened, offended at the suggestion of weakness. "My house never shows its alarm." "I know." He offered the shadow of a smile, a courtesy that cost him nothing and earned him a faint thaw in her expression. "Listen for the footsteps that have learned a new language. If you hear them, send word to the Quai des Orfèvres. Ask for me." He stepped out into the street where the fog had thinned to a cold veil, the outlines of passers-by sharper now, their eyes less dreamy and more guarded. The sign of the café, a parrot painted in gaudy blue that the grey day reduced to a sullen smudge, swung on its chain with a complaining creak. He paused at the curb, watching the corner as a fisherman watches the surface for the faintest telltale ripple. Somewhere along that bar, between the mirror dulled by countless breathings and the zinc counter dappled with beer rings, a man had left a print of himself in absence. Before moving on, he felt the street's pulse one more time, the scrape of a broom, the cut-glass laughter of a woman who could not afford laughter, the low exchange between 2 men whose words were nothing and whose gaze was everything. The city did not offer him secrets. It offered him temperatures, and he knew, by instinct, when the fever climbed. He set off for the café with a gait that seemed unhurried and was nothing of the sort, the pipe now lit and trailing that mellow cloud which, to those who knew him, meant he was walking inside his own weather, patient and fixed. Behind him, the concierge returned to her lodge, to her violet oilcloth, to her little clock that counted out the seconds with a diligence that comforted her. Above them, the brown door waited, and the photograph, turned to face the room's heart at last, watched the dust continue its slow dance in the morning gloom. The parrot on the corner was not much of a parrot. Its wooden sign, once gaudy, had been dulled by years of rain and the soot that settled on every surface in Paris. The blue was more grey now, the painted feathers worn, into vague streaks that might have been plumage or simply weather. Still it swung defiantly on its iron chain above the tram stop, squealing a complaint whenever the wind caught it. The café itself, Le Perroquet Bleu, was narrow, dim, and smelled of damp wool and yesterday's smoke. Maigret pushed open the door and stepped into its warm, stale breath, brushing the fog from his shoulders like a man entering a cave. Inside, the zinc counter stretched in a tired line, its surface dulled by the passage of elbows and wet glasses. A mirror behind it, once meant to enlarge the room, only reflected shadows and the occasional flicker of movement. A handful of patrons occupied the tables, men in hats pulled low, women with scarves knotted under their chins, the sort of customers who sat with an air of permanent residence, as though their lives had been anchored to this café long before the city changed around them. The barman, a heavy-set fellow with a red face and thinning hair, polished a glass with the slowness of a man who had already polished 1,000 and would polish 1,000 more. Maigret's pipe was unlit, but he held it between his teeth as naturally as a man holds a thought. He moved to the counter, unbuttoning his coat, his hat dripping faintly from the mist. The barman gave him a glance, then a shrug as if to say, "Another man, another day, nothing to note." "A Calvados," Maigret murmured, placing a coin on the zinc. His voice carried that mixture of quiet authority and indifference which ensured service without fuss. The glass was produced, filled with a generous measure of pale gold, its aroma sharp as apples left too long in the cellar. He let it rest before him, surveying the room as if admiring the paintwork. At a table near the window, 2 men bent their heads close, speaking in tones that avoided the ear, but not the eye. Their clothes were modest, their boots worn but polished, the kind of men who carried their fatigue like a second coat. A woman sat alone by the stove, her knitting needles moving in steady rhythm, the wool a dark thread between her hands. She did not look up once. At the far end, a man with a newspaper held it too close to his face, his eyes darting to the mirror as though he feared the reflection might betray him. "Busy evenings here?" Maigret asked the barman after a pause, his gaze still lingering on the glass. "Depends." The man's voice was flat, the kind born of long repetition. "The tram brings some. Others drift in from the side streets, sometimes too many, sometimes none. Never the same twice. And a man who comes alone, sits quiet, drinks little. Would he be noticed?" The barman set down the glass he had been polishing, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Depends on the man. He might be of average height, thin but not sickly. A face you would forget as soon as he left. He does not speak much, pays in coins, keeps to himself." "Ah." The word was drawn out, not quite an acknowledgement, more the sound of memory stirring. "Him comes sometimes, always alone. He sits there." He jerked his chin toward the table near the stove, where the knitting woman now gathered her wool into a ball. "Never stays long. 1 glass of wine, that's all. Red, the cheap one. Drinks it slow, then leaves." "Did he speak to anyone?" "Not to me, not to them." The barman gestured vaguely to the room, as though the patrons themselves had blurred into one enduring presence. Maybe he nodded once, maybe twice, never more. "Do you know his name?" The barman gave a short, dry laugh. "Do men like that leave names behind? He might have told me once. If he did, it didn't matter enough to remember." The Calvados burned softly down Maigret's throat, a warmth that spread not just to the body, but to the patient's. He set the glass down, the base clicking faintly against the zinc. "He received a postcard," he said quietly. "Provincial, church on the front. Would he have read it here?" The barman considered, scratching his cheek with thick fingers. "I've seen him with paper in his hands. Could have been a postcard, could have been a bill. He folded it quick, always folded quick, as if afraid the words might fly away." The 2 men by the window rose, adjusting their coats, and left without a backward glance. The door banged softly, letting in a breath of fog. The woman with the knitting had already disappeared, though Maigret had not noticed her departure. Only the man with the newspaper remained, though his pages trembled faintly as if stirred by more than draught. "Does he talk when he drinks?" Not a word, not even to order, just points. Maigret's eyes flicked to the mirror. The man with the newspaper lowered it just enough to reveal a narrow face, eyes sharp with the unease of someone caught between fear and defiance. Their gazes met for an instant. Then the paper rose again. He turned back to the barman. "And when he leaves?" "Always the same. Pays exact, no tip, coat buttoned, hat low. Walks as if the street belonged to him, but he wanted no one to notice." Maigret lit his pipe at last, the smoke unfurling with a sweetness that fought the cafe's stale air. He leaned slightly on the counter, his weight settling like a verdict. "I will sit a while. Perhaps he comes today." The barman shrugged, took up another glass, and resumed his eternal polishing. Hours in a cafe are not like hours elsewhere. They pass in circles, measured by the scraping of chairs, the rise and fall of voices, the refilling of glasses. Maigret waited, the Calvados sipped, the pipe refilled, his gaze steady but never sharp enough to alarm. Customers came and went, some familiar to the barman, others strangers with the look of men escaping weather or wives. Outside, the tram rang its bell, the sound flat against the fog. At one point, the man with the newspaper left abruptly, leaving his drink, half finished. His chair scraped too loud, his departure too swift. Maigret did not move. He only watched the door close, the street reclaiming him. In his experience, those who leave too fast often circle back like moths, unable to resist the flame they fear. Late afternoon brought a lull. The barman leaned on his counter, yawning, while a boy delivered a crate of bottles to the back. The cafe smelled of damp cork and spilled wine. Maigret stood, stretched his shoulders, and wandered toward the table near the stove, the seat the tenant was said to favour. He lowered himself into the chair, feeling the wood sag slightly as though acknowledging a familiar weight. On the table's edge, faint but visible, was the ring of a glass not yet erased by time. He traced it with a finger, the gesture slow, thoughtful, as though reading Braille. He imagined the man, Duval or whatever he called himself, sitting there, staring at nothing, folding his postcard with deliberate care, sipping his watered wine. Silence again, not absence. Silence that drew attention by refusing to participate. A man who does not speak in a cafe speaks louder than any drunk who sings. When Maigret rose to leave, he nodded once to the barman. "If he returns, you will send word." The barman's mouth twisted, half amusement, half resignation. "If he returns, you'll know before I do." Out in the street, the fog had begun to lift at last, though the damp clung stubbornly to the stones. The tram rattled past, sparks leaping briefly from its cables. Across the way, a boy chased a hoop, his laughter too sharp against the air, his mother scolding in tones softened by weariness. Maigret stood for a moment, drawing on his pipe, his eyes moving from the cafe's dull sign to the length of Rue des Martyrs that stretched into a haze of indistinct lives. Somewhere among these doors, in the stairwells and back rooms, in cafes where no one spoke names, a man had left an imprint of himself. And as always, it was not the bold gestures but the silences, the hesitations, the faint traces on zinc and wood that told the story worth following. He set off again, heavy, deliberate, pipe glowing like a coal in the dusk, the rhythm of his steps in tune with the city's quiet unease. The case had not opened, it had only deepened, like fog that thins above and thickens below, forcing the eyes to search harder, the mind to listen closer. At the Quai des Orfèvres the lamps burned with their steady yellow gloom, filling the corridors with an air of bureaucratic melancholy that seemed eternal. Clerks shuffled papers, the telegraph clattered faintly in its corner, and the scent of tobacco mingled with the sharp tang of ink. Maigret sat in his office, shoulders hunched, the stem of his pipe clamped between his teeth, staring not at the reports spread before him, but at the slow swirl of smoke curling upward. It was near dusk, and the Seine outside flowed sluggishly, its surface mottled with the reflected lamps of the bridges, glimmering like coins tossed into dark water. Janvier entered quietly, a thin sheaf of messages in his hand, his expression somewhere between eagerness and fatigue. "A telegram, Chief," he said, laying it on the desk with that careful reverence young inspectors still afforded to every scrap of evidence. "Came not an hour ago, from Saint-Amand in the Allier." Maigret grunted, tamping his pipe, his eyes narrowing as they passed over the slip of paper. The message was succinct, stripped of embellishment, as all telegrams were, its words hammered in iron. Duval, lodging here last winter, left debts, frequented Café du Commerce, known to be secretive, stop. Signed by the local gendarmerie. Saint-Amand, Maigret murmured, rolling the syllables on his tongue. A small town, railway junction, nothing more. Why does it follow him here? He looked up at Janvier. Did they send a description? No, Chief, only that. And a note. One man there claims he saw him again last month. Last month? Maigret exhaled, a heavy sigh through the nose. He leaned back in his chair, making the wood groan under his bulk. He had learned long ago that telegrams carried not answers, but provocations. They were fragments, the dry bones of a skeleton whose flesh remained hidden. Yet this one confirmed what he had suspected. The silence of Rue des Martyrs did not begin in Paris. It had roots in the provinces, in places where lives were quieter, debts more noticeable, and silence more eloquent than words. He rose, paced to the window, and looked out over the river where the fog still clung in grey shreds to the water. Paris breathed differently at this hour, the voices on the embankment sharper, the laughter from the cafes more brittle, as though darkness pressed people closer to their own secrets. Behind him, Janvier spoke softly. "Do you think he ran from there to here?" "Men do not run from nothing," Maigret replied. "If he carried debts, he carried something more. Debts alone do not make a man vanish into a silence that disturbs an entire street." He tapped the telegram against his palm, feeling the weight of the words. "We will send a man to Saint-Amand, Lucas perhaps. He has the patience for provincial cafes. But for now—" He turned back, eyes heavy-lidded but bright, with the slow fire of determination. "For now we wait here. The provinces have a way of sending their ghosts to Paris, and when they do, they always arrive by train." He pocketed the telegram, donned his hat, and left the office. The evening air outside was thick with drizzle, the lamps along the quay glowing dimly through their glass cages. He walked with his heavy, deliberate gait, pipe smoke trailing behind him like a second shadow. By the time he reached Boulevard de Clichy, the drizzle had turned to fine rain, stippling the cobblestones, shining the windows of cafes where men huddled with their Pernod and their gossip. He paused beneath the awning of a tobacco shop, lighting his pipe anew, and watched the blur of headlights as a carriage rattled past. Somewhere not far off, Rue des Martyrs waited, its silence unbroken, its tenants restless. But tonight the silence had a new dimension, the echo of Saint-Amand, a provincial town that seemed to have lent its unease to Paris. The telegram whispered of debts, and debts in the provinces were never abstract. They meant a baker unpaid, a landlord cheated, a cafe owner left with empty promises. In Paris such things dissolved into the noise, but in a town where everyone knew one another, debts clung like mud on boots. People remembered, people spoke, and silence itself became a form of guilt. He thought of the tenant's room, of the folded train tickets, of the photograph turned to the light. He thought of the café receipt from Le Perroquet Bleu, of the absence that had made itself louder than presence. Now he added the telegram to the list, another piece in a puzzle that was not yet a puzzle, but a series of shadows overlapping on a wall. At the tram stop, he boarded without hurry, his bulk filling the narrow seat, his hat pulled low. Passengers swayed around him as the car lurched forward, the conductor clanging the bell with mechanical cheer. The rain beat faintly against the glass, blurring the outlines of shops and houses, rendering Paris into a watercolour of damp greys and yellows. As the tram climbed toward Montmartre, Maigret's thoughts lingered on the peculiar weight of rumour. A telegram was not proof. It was rumour in uniform, clothed in official brevity, carrying the authority of distance. Yet rumour, once it reached Paris, had a way of growing, attaching itself to other fragments, weaving a story before the facts could catch up. He knew that tomorrow or the next day the newspapers might seize upon it, dressing it in scandal, inflating the debts into crimes, the silence into conspiracy. And already he felt the pressure of the city's appetite, its hunger for mystery, for drama in every quiet street. The tram rattled to its stop, and Maigret descended, his pipe clenched firmly, his coat collar beaded with rain. He walked back into Rue des Martyrs, its damp stones shining faintly, its silence now tinged with the invisible thread that stretched all the way to Saint-Amand. The concierge emerged from her lodge as if summoned by his presence. Her shawl was tighter, her eyes sharper. "You've news?" she asked, half in hope, half in dread. "A telegram," he said simply. "From the provinces." Her mouth pressed into a line. "They never leave a man alone, the provinces. They follow him like a shadow." Maigret studied her, the way she clutched her shawl, the way her eyes flicked toward the stairwell as though expecting the tenant to descend at that very moment. "Tell me, madam," he said quietly. "When you think of him, do you see a man, or only a silence?" She hesitated, her lips parting, then closing again. Finally, she whispered, "Only the silence." He nodded, turned, and climbed the stairs once more, his footsteps deliberate, unhurried, echoing faintly. At the brown door he paused, listening, his ear tilted toward the wood. Still nothing. The silence lay as heavily as ever. Yet now it was joined by something else. The faint, insistent hum of distance, as if Saint-Amand itself had pressed its ear against this door. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and let the smoke curl against the dim stairwell. The case had begun with whispers on Rue des Martyrs, but tonight it stretched beyond Paris, pulling at him with the weight of provinces, of debts, of ghosts carried by telegrams. And Maigret, steady as the river itself, knew he would follow the thread wherever it led, through silence, through rumour, through the long corridors of both the city and the countryside. The silence was no longer merely local. It was a silence that travelled, that attached itself to men and places, that seeped from one café to another, from a provincial church to a Parisian attic. And Maigret, standing in that dim stairwell with his pipe glowing faintly in the dark, felt its pressure more strongly than ever, as if the silence itself had sent the telegram. The rain had washed the cobbles clean by morning, leaving Rue des Martyrs with the fragile gleam of a street that had tried to forget its shadows. But the air, damp and metallic, still clung to the stones like memory itself. Maigret returned with his usual unhurried stride, the collar of his coat raised, the bowl of his pipe tucked in the cup of his hand. He had decided to look again at the tenant's room, not with the eyes of a policeman eager for clues, but with the patience of a man who had learned that rooms, like people, often reveal more after the second meeting. The The concierge, who had clearly been waiting for him, handed over the pass key without a word. She stood in her lodge doorway like a guardian unwilling to climb, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes restless. Maigret gave her no reassurance. He had none to give. He mounted the stairs, the wood groaning beneath his weight, each step a slow punctuation in the building's silence. By the time he reached the 4th floor, the air seemed to have thickened, as though the house itself were aware of his purpose. He turned the key and entered. The room was as it had been, yet not. There was a curious sense that something invisible had shifted, as if the absence itself had become aware of scrutiny. He closed the door behind him, leaned against it for a moment, and simply breathed in the room's stale perfume. Tobacco grown cold, kerosene faint in the corners, dust disturbed only by the draught from the courtyard window. He stood still, listening to the silence which pressed on his ears with the same weight as a voice one cannot quite catch. The bed, narrow and metallic, carried the imprint of order without comfort. It was not the kind of bed a man slept in willingly, but the kind a man tolerated like a cell or a hospital cot. Maigret sat on its edge, testing the springs which answered with a faint protest. From here he could see the entire room at once, the washstand, the table, the chair, the window where the photograph now faced outward, exposing the woman's gaze. He had left it that way deliberately. If the tenant returned, he would know. Maigret rose and approached the table. The railway timetable was still there, pages creased like a book often consulted but never cherished. He studied the folded receipt from Le Perroquet Bleu, running a thumb over the blurred ink as though the pressure of his skin might coax forth a memory. His pipe smoke curled over the objects, and he felt the curious sensation that the tenant had been seated here not long before, bending over the table in the lamplight, charting his silence as others might chart a journey. He knelt by the suitcase again, though he knew its contents by heart. The shirts worn thin, the scarf, the socks carefully darned. Such care in mending suggested someone else's hands, a woman's perhaps, before he came to Paris. The tickets, still unused, stared back at him with their mute promise of departures not taken. 5 doors, 5 exits, all ignored. A man who hoards possibilities yet remains immobile. Why? The washstand offered no new revelations, though the soap had worn further into its dish, as if touched since his last visit. He ran a hand along the rim of the basin. Damp. Not freshly so, but not dry either. He straightened, pipe clenched, and considered. Either the tenant had returned unseen, or another had entered the room in his absence. The photograph, however, held him. He took it in hand again, studying the woman seated on the bench, her eyes fixed not on the camera, but just beside it, as if looking past the photographer towards something more significant. Her hands were folded in her lap, with a resignation that suggested habit, not posing. He turned it over once more, reading the faint stamp of a provincial photographer, its name too blurred to give certainty. He imagined the tenant placing it on the sill, to show, but to remind, to keep her present in the room's dim light. He returned the photograph carefully to its place and sat in the chair. The seat creaked under his bulk, and he felt the hollows worn by a lighter frame. He remained still, puffing at his pipe, as though by inhabiting the man's chair he might absorb some echo of thought. What did the tenant see when he stared at this table, at this timetable, at this photograph? Not the objects themselves, but what they stood for, the chance of escape, the weight of memory, the tether of a face. And yet he had not left, had not cut the thread, had not taken even one of the 5 trains. The room seemed less a place of residence than a stage for waiting. But waiting for what? A message? A person? The right hour to vanish? He glanced at the floor. Dust gathered thickly in the corners, yet near the door the boards were scuffed as though paced upon by someone restless, uncertain. He crouched, his heavy knees protesting, and examined the scuffs. They were recent. He traced them toward the window, where a faint streak marred the sill, as if a hand had lingered there. The latch bore the faintest mark, too clean in one spot, as though a finger had pressed it often. He opened the window. The courtyard below was damp, its paving stones shining with rain. A line of laundry sagged in the mist, shirts swaying like abandoned sails. He looked upward. The roof sloped steeply, tiles slick with water. No easy exit there. He shut the window and locked it again, the faint click loud in the hush. He rose heavily, paced once across the room, and paused by the trunk-shaped gap in the corner where absence spoke more clearly than presence. A trunk once stood there. It had been removed. When and by whom? He touched the wall where the dust line still marked its dimensions. Something had been carried out, and the room had grown lighter for it, yet heavier in implication. The silence grew thicker. He felt it pressing, as though the very plaster wished to speak. He drew deep on his pipe, exhaling toward the ceiling. "Who are you, my silent tenant?" he murmured, his voice almost tender. "And why do you sit among timetables you do not use, tickets you do not spend, debts you do not pay?" The room, of course, gave no answer. At length he stood, replaced the chair exactly where it had been, and looked around once more. He would leave everything untouched, yet he carried the weight of it within him. Rooms, he knew, were like people. They spoke most clearly when one listened long enough without interruption. This room had told him of a man divided between departure and immobility, between debt and memory, between the provinces and Paris. He locked the door behind him and descended the stairs, the concierge waiting as before, her face taut with unasked questions. He did not satisfy them. "Your tenant leaves more behind in silence than most men do in words," he said softly, and stepped out into the street. The air smelled of rain and coal smoke. The fog had thinned, but the street was no brighter for it. He paused, pipe in hand, feeling the weight of the attic room within him, its silence now part of his own. Somewhere, perhaps at the end of one of those unused tickets, or in the eyes of the woman in the photograph, the key lay waiting. For now he walked into the Paris dusk, heavy and deliberate, as the street folded itself once more into secrecy. Paris after rain has its own temperament, as if the stones themselves retain a memory of the water and release it, slowly, mingling with coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint tang of roasted chestnuts from a cart at the corner. The lamps along Rue des Martyrs flickered that evening with renewed intensity, their halos sharpened by the drying air. Maigret, shoulders stooped, pipe glowing faintly, moved with his usual deliberation through the street, his steps neither hurried nor idle. He had no appointment, no summons, only the intuition, bred from years of listening to the city, that something would stir if he kept himself present long enough. At the corner where the tram rattled by with a squeal of brakes, a narrow alley opened, so tight between the buildings that two men could scarcely walk abreast. It was one of those passages the city kept hidden, useful for shortcuts, for children's games, for lovers and thieves alike. Tonight it breathed a darker promise, its cobbles still slick with rain, its lamplight failing before the gloom swallowed it whole. Maigret paused, pipe stem clenched between his teeth, and studied it. He had walked past it a dozen times, yet tonight it seemed to call him, like a stage awaiting the entry of an actor. He turned into the passage. The air grew colder. Immediately, the walls on either side dripping with moisture, the faint odour of garbage mingling with the sharper smell of coal soot. His footsteps echoed strangely, bouncing back as if the alley itself were reluctant to let them escape. Halfway along, he halted. Something had moved. Not the scurrying of a rat, nor the shifting of laundry in a breeze. A shape, human, hesitant, slipped further into the darkness ahead, barely more than a shadow against shadows. Maigret did not call out. He drew once from his pipe, exhaled, and continued forward at the same pace, as though nothing had changed. His heart did not quicken. He had long ago trained it to remain steady. Only his senses sharpened, attuned to the scrape of a shoe, the brush of cloth against damp stone. The alley narrowed further, bending slightly, and there, against the far wall, the shadow lingered. A man, perhaps, tall or simply elongated by the failing light. Still as a cutout. Watching. "Bonsoir," Maigret said, his voice quiet but filling the space. The shadow shifted, and for an instant the glow of a match flared, illuminating a face only briefly. Thin, angular, eyes sunk deep, the flame trembling as it lit a cigarette. Then darkness again, the ember glowing faintly, a small red star in the void. "You're late for your train," Maigret added, almost conversationally. The ember brightened, then dimmed. The man did not reply. He took a drag, exhaled, and the smoke mingled with Maigret's own pipe smoke, the two scents clashing mid-air like adversaries meeting on neutral ground. "Or perhaps you have no intention of leaving," Maigret continued, stepping closer. His heavy shoes pressed the wet stones, each step deliberate, echoing like a metronome. "Perhaps you enjoy silence too much." The man moved at last, not toward him, but sideways, slipping deeper into the bend of the alley. It was a retreat, though not a flight. Maigret advanced a pace more quickly, pipe clenched harder between his teeth, but when the bend opened into a broader space where another street cut across, the shadow was gone. The street lay empty, the rainwater glistening in the gutter, a cat darting across with its tail high. Only the faint odour of smoke remained, clinging to the damp walls. Maigret stood still, filling the space with his bulk, his breath steady. He had not expected to seize the man, not tonight. He knew better. Encounters like these were less about capture than about acknowledgement. The shadow had revealed itself, had allowed itself to be glimpsed, and that was enough. It meant the silence of Rue des Martyrs was not merely absence, it was inhabited. Someone watched, listened, measured his steps as he measured theirs. He retraced his way through the alley, back onto Rue des Martyrs, where the lamps glowed with a steadier calm. The concierge, vigilant as ever, was at her doorway, pretending to polish a copper pot, though her eyes were fixed on the street. She straightened as he emerged. "You saw something?" she asked, her voice pitched low, conspiratorial. "I saw enough," he said, brushing the rain from his coat sleeve. She hesitated, then whispered, "Was it him?" He considered the question, the ember of his pipe glowing in the dusk. "It was a man," he said. "Whether it was your tenant or simply a shadow that has learned to walk, I cannot yet say." Her eyes narrowed, unsatisfied. But she said no more, retreating into her lodge, the copper pot forgotten. Maigret remained on the pavement, pipe between his teeth, his gaze drifting toward the attic window above. It was dark, unlit, a blank square in the facade. He wondered if eyes looked down from there even now, if the shadow in the alley had already returned and was watching him watch the window. The thought did not disturb him. On the contrary, it confirmed what he already knew. Silence was never empty. Silence was always inhabited. He walked slowly toward the corner café, Le Perroquet Bleu. Inside, the usual customers hunched over their glasses, voices low, eyes quick. The barman, polishing as always, gave him a curt nod. Maigret ordered wine this time, sipping it without hurry, letting the warmth trickle down while he watched the mirror behind the bar. Every face reflected there seemed complicit in something unsaid. He did not search for the shadow. Shadows rarely revealed themselves twice in one night, but he let the presence linger, half in his pipe smoke, half in the corner of his mind. When he rose to leave, the barman leaned closer. "You had company in the alley tonight," he muttered. Maigret's eyes flicked toward him. "You saw?" "No, but word runs quick. Someone said a man slipped out the back door not long before you came. Thin fellow, hat low. Didn't finish his drink." Maigret nodded once, nothing more, and stepped back into the night. The fog had not returned, but the darkness seemed thicker, as though the city itself conspired with silence. He walked toward the Seine, pipe ember glowing faintly, the rhythm of his footsteps unchanging. The shadow might vanish, but its presence would remain, stitched into the fabric of the case, waiting to be tugged free at the right moment. And as he crossed into the broader avenue, he felt again that quiet certainty. This was no ordinary tenant, no ordinary silence. The city itself had grown complicit, offering alleys and cafes as hiding places, lending its fog, its rain, its shadows. And Maigret, patient as the river, would follow each thread, each whisper of smoke, until the silence spoke at last. The following morning, Paris awoke to headlines, and the silence of Rue des Martyrs was no longer confined to its narrow, cobbled length. It had been translated into ink, and ink has a way of turning shadows into shapes more vivid than reality. Maigret, arriving at the Quai des Orfèvres, saw the folded papers stacked high on kiosks, their bold black letters shouting in the drizzle. "Mysterious tenant in Rue des Martyrs. Police inquiry into silent lodger." Already the city had taken hold of the story, magnifying it, bending it to its appetite for drama. He bought one copy at the corner, his large hand dwarfing the flimsy sheet, and stood under the awning to read. The article was no more than half a column, stitched together from fragments, yet its tone had the authority of invention. It described the tenant as a man of aristocratic bearing, a recluse hiding from scandal, or perhaps an anarchist plotting in shadows. It mentioned debts in the provinces, whisperings of a woman's face, and concluded with the claim, entirely fabricated, that the police had already identified him but refused to disclose his name. Maigret folded the paper without anger. He had long known the press was both adversary and accomplice. They fed on silence, on hints, on the very air of mystery, until rumour became fact by the sheer weight of repetition. Yet beneath the embellishments there was always the danger that someone somewhere would recognize themselves in the description and step forward, or that a lie once told would summon its own truth. At the quay, the clerks were already whispering, their voices carrying across the corridors like the rustle of dry leaves. Janvier brought another telegram, this one from Clermont-Ferrand, equally terse, reporting that Duval had once lodged there under yet another name, leaving behind suspicion more than fact. Maigret set it aside with a grunt. A man who scattered aliases through the provinces was no stranger to reinvention, and the newspapers, with their gift for embroidery, would only assist his concealment. By noon, 2 reporters were waiting outside his office, hats in hand, faces eager. They pressed him with questions. Was the tenant connected to political groups? Was he a deserter from the army? Had he been seen with women of questionable reputation? Maigret listened, pipe unlit, eyes heavy-lidded. When at last he spoke, It was in that gravelly softness that could be mistaken for fatigue, but was, in truth, calculation. Gentlemen, a man who pays his rent late and smokes cheap tobacco is hardly the stuff of revolution. If I had answers, they would not be for the newspaper first. The reporters scribbled anyway, eager to twist even silence into words. Maigret dismissed them with a wave, retreating into the smoke of his office. He knew their work would spread by evening, colouring the case with more invention, more intrigue, until the public itself became part of the investigation. That afternoon he returned to Rue des Martyrs. The concierge met him with her habitual sharpness, but now her eyes gleamed with a kind of pride. "They wrote about my house," she said, holding up a newspaper. "Imagine our little street in print. Everyone is asking me questions." "And what do you tell them?" Maigret asked. She drew herself up. "That the tenant is strange, but harmless. That I keep my house well and there is nothing to fear." Yet, even as she spoke, her glance flickered toward the stairwell, as though the brown door above had grown heavier with notoriety. Fame was a burden a building carried poorly. Tenants now looked at one another with suspicion, each wondering what secrets their neighbour might hold, each listening more keenly to the creak of the stairs at night. Rumour had transformed the atmosphere, thickening it like fog. That evening, at Le Perroquet Bleu, the effect was more dramatic. The café, usually half empty, buzzed with conversation. Men leaned across tables, voices lowered yet urgent, each offering his theory. One swore the tenant was a ruined nobleman hiding from creditors. Another claimed he was an escaped convict, his silence proof of guilt. A woman insisted she had once seen him in Marseille, dressed as a sailor. The barman, shrugging, served glass after glass, his weary eyes betraying the pleasure of being at the centre of gossip. Maigret took his usual place at the counter, calvados before him, pipe smoke curling. He did not ask questions. He let the stories wash over him, noting which details recurred, which names surfaced too readily. Rumour, he knew, was never entirely invention. It borrowed scraps from truth, weaving them into patterns. A man described as tall, thin, silent, yes, that much aligned. A man with debts in Saint-Amand, confirmed by telegram. A woman's photograph in his room, perhaps the same who now became a baroness, a widow, a cabaret singer, depending on who told it. The truth lay not in the embellishments, but in the stubborn persistence of certain details. Outside, as he left the café, the evening paper boys were already crying the latest headlines. Mystery deepens. Shadowy tenant linked to provincial scandals. The ink was barely dry, yet Paris devoured it, hungry for each turn. He imagined men in cafes across the city, women in markets, clerks at their desks, all murmuring about the tenant of Rue des Martyrs, as though they had known him personally. The case had become not merely an inquiry, but a spectacle, and Maigret understood the danger. Once a story belongs to the public, it no longer obeys the slow patience of police work. Back at his flat that night, Madame Maigret looked up from her knitting as he hung his coat. "I read about it," she said, her voice mild, though her eyes studied him with quiet concern. "About what?" "Your silent tenant. They make him sound like a ghost haunting Paris." Maigret grunted, lowering himself into his chair. He filled his pipe, lit it, and let the smoke rise, as if to obscure the headlines. "Ghosts are easier to catch than men," he muttered. She did not press him. She never did. She returned to her needles, the click of them steady, a rhythm that soothed. Maigret sat in silence, pipe in hand, staring into the lamplight. Outside, the city whispered his case into 1,000 variations, while inside he weighed the fragments, a room too orderly, a suitcase too empty, train tickets unused, a photograph turned toward the light, debts in Saint-Amand, a claim check at Gare du Nord, and now a shadow in an alley. Rumour had given him nothing concrete, yet it had changed the atmosphere, widened the circle of attention. He knew the tenant, wherever he was, would feel it too. Silence is fragile once the world begins to speak for it. A man who hides in shadows does not welcome his own myth, for myth draws eyes, and eyes strip away concealment. He puffed at his pipe, exhaling slowly. The case had entered a new stage. It was no longer confined to one building, one street. It belonged to Paris now, to the cafes, to the papers, to the whispering mouths of thousands, and somewhere among them the tenant himself would read or hear, and he would know. The city had found him, even if Maigret had not. And so the silence that began in Rue des Martyrs had been broken not by confession, not by discovery, but by rumour in the press, by ink and speculation, by the hunger of a city that thrived on shadows. Maigret, heavy and deliberate in his chair, pipe glowing faintly in the lamplight, understood that the game had shifted. The man he pursued was no longer merely silent. He was being spoken for by the entire city, and that, sooner or later, would force him to act. The train that carried Maigret southward left Paris under a sky the colour of pewter, its whistle tearing through the damp morning. He sat in the corner of a compartment, hat brim low, pipe unlit in deference to the no-smoking signs, his heavy coat folded across his knees. He disliked travel, not for its discomfort, but for its suspension of time. The rhythm of the wheels lulled one into reflection, and reflection, though necessary, offered no answers. He stared out at the passing fields, bare in late season, punctuated by the black skeletons of trees and the occasional church steeple rising above clusters of houses. Each town looked alike from the train, each station a repetition of damp platforms, enamel signs, and idling porters. Yet he knew that one of these towns, Saint-Amand, Clermont, perhaps another, had once harboured his tenant under one of his many names. By early afternoon, the train slowed, squealing into the station of Saint-Amand. A modest place, one platform, a waiting room with wooden benches, a coal stove smoking reluctantly, and a clock whose hands moved with provincial stubbornness. Maigret stepped down, the gravel crunching under his soles, and filled his pipe at last. The tobacco smoke curled into the cold air, the first comfort since leaving Paris. The town itself stretched in narrow streets lined with houses that bore the resigned look of places accustomed to being overlooked. A café faced the square, its awning faded, its windows clouded by steam. A baker's shop exhaled the sharp smell of fresh loaves, mingling with the odour of manure from carts that had just rolled through. He made his way to the gendarmerie, a squat building with peeling shutters where the local sergeant greeted him with that blend of pride and deference the provinces reserved for officials from the capital. "You're here about Duval," the sergeant said at once, offering a handshake that was both firm and clammy. Yes, he stayed here. Not under that name, of course. He called himself Lemoine then, rented a room above the Café du Commerce. Maigret followed him through the town, listening. "What sort of man was he?" The sergeant shrugged. "Quiet, paid late, never caused a scene, but people noticed. He asked few questions, answered fewer. Spent evenings at the café, drinking little, smoking much. The landlord said he kept to himself, though now and then he would scribble in a notebook. Some thought he was a clerk out of work, others that he was hiding from creditors. After a while he disappeared. Left his bill unpaid, of course. At the Café du Commerce, the landlord confirmed the account. A stout man with a florid nose and eyes perpetually watery, he leaned across the counter as he spoke. Yes, Lemoine, thin fellow, pale, never laughed, not once. Sat at that corner table near the stove, always alone. He drank vin ordinaire, never more than a glass. Some nights he would stare at the door, as if waiting for someone who never came. Then one day he was gone. Left nothing but a shirt collar and a few cigarette stubs. That was 3 months ago, maybe 4. We thought little of it. Men come and go. Maigret lit his pipe, exhaled, and glanced at the corner table. It was empty now, though the marks of glasses scarred its wood, circles overlapping like the rings of a tree. He seated himself there, felt the warmth of the stove at his back, and tried to imagine the silent figure, pale face bent over a notebook, eyes flicking to the door. Waiting. Always waiting. For what or for whom? When he asked about the notebook, the landlord shook his head. Took it with him? Or perhaps he burned it? Who knows? In the town, others offered fragments. A grocer remembered him buying little, bread, sardines, cheap wine. A seamstress recalled his coat, too large for his frame, as though borrowed. An old man swore he had seen him at the church, not praying, but sitting in the back pew, watching the altar, with a gaze both vacant and intent. Everyone agreed on one thing: he had left no trace behind, yet his absence lingered. That evening Maigret walked the square, pipe glowing faintly, the town already dark. Lamps lit the windows of houses, but the streets themselves were deserted. He paused at the station, watching a train arrive, its handful of passengers disembarking with weary faces. He thought of the 5 unused tickets in the tenant's suitcase, each pointing toward towns like this, towns where memory was long and rumor longer. The man had scattered himself like a ghost across the provinces, leaving behind debts, suspicions, fragments of identity. At Clermont-Ferrand the story was the same. Another alias, another lodging house, another trail of silence. The landlady there, a sharp-faced widow, recalled how he had arrived with only a suitcase and a claim check, how he kept to his room, writing letters she never saw posted. He spoke politely, but distantly, as if measuring each word. When asked his profession, he smiled faintly and said, "I have none." After 6 weeks he vanished, leaving behind an unpaid bill and the smell of tobacco that clung to the wallpaper long after. What struck Maigret was not the debts. They were modest, never more than a few francs, but the consistency of behavior. Always the same pattern: a room, a corner table in a cafe, a single glass of wine, silence, waiting. Then disappearance. Each town remembered him not for what he did, but for what he withheld. He was a ghost, not because he lacked substance, but because he carried with him the aura of transience, the sense that he belonged nowhere. On the return train to Paris, Maigret sat heavy in his seat, pipe smoke curling against the window. He reflected on the oddity of a man who seemed to cultivate absence as deliberately as others cultivate presence. Most men left behind quarrels, laughter, friendships, lovers, enemies. This man left only silence, and yet that silence was more disturbing than any scandal. It unsettled tenants, concierges, landlords, waiters. It followed him across towns so that when he left, people remembered him more than if he had stayed. Back in Rue de Martyrs, the atmosphere had grown thicker still. The newspapers had reported the provincial fragments with relish, painting the tenant as a man pursued by shadows of his own making. The concierge told Maigret, her voice trembling with excitement, that strangers had come to the street asking questions. Reporters, yes, but also curious onlookers, neighbors from adjoining streets, even a woman who claimed she might have known him years before. "The house feels heavier," she whispered, "as if every stair has learned his name, though none of us know it." Maigret nodded, pipe clenched, eyes steady. He had returned with no more answers than before, only confirmation. The tenant, was a man who spread silence like an infection, a presence that turned absence into memory. He had lived in the provinces like a ghost, and now he haunted Paris. That night, as Maigret stood once more in the alley where the shadow had slipped away, he reflected on the peculiar truth of ghosts. They are not unreal. They are what people make of the fragments left behind, and this man, whatever name he bore, had perfected the art of leaving fragments, debts unpaid, faces glimpsed, silences too heavy to forget. The provinces had remembered him, not for his deeds, but for his silence, and now that silence had reached Paris, where it would no longer remain content in shadows. It was late when the moment arrived, so late that Paris itself seemed to have withdrawn into its own hushed corners, as though reluctant to intrude. The lamps along Rue des Martyrs hummed in their glass cages, the fog pressed down once more upon the sloping roofs, and the shutters of the shops clicked faintly in the wind. Maigret had been waiting, though he had not admitted it to himself. He had walked the length of the street 3 times, stopping now and then beneath the parrot sign of the café, then circling back, his pipe glowing steadily in the dark. Patience was his métier, and patience tonight was rewarded. A figure appeared near the alley, moving slowly, almost casually, as if the night were his own. Thin, coat buttoned high, hat low, the man seemed to materialize from the fog rather than emerge from it. He did not hurry, nor did he falter. He walked toward number 72 with the air of one returning home after a long absence, though every step betrayed the tension of a man measuring his audience. Maigret followed, not closely, not with menace, but with the deliberate tread of inevitability. The man reached the door, produced his key, and fumbled slightly at the lock. That was when Maigret spoke, his voice calm, almost courteous. "You've been away." The man stiffened, his back rigid, then turned slowly. For a moment their eyes met in the dim lamplight. They were eyes that carried fatigue, suspicion, and the faint glimmer of defiance. He said nothing, merely inclined his head, as though acknowledging a neighbor. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Maigret entered behind him. The concierge, half hidden in her lodge, rose at once, her shawl clutched tight, eyes darting between them. Maigret silenced her with a look. The man climbed the stairs, his steps deliberate, his hand grazing the rail as if to steady himself. Maigret followed, the stairwell echoing faintly with the rhythm of their ascent. At the 4th floor, the tenant paused before the brown door. He unlocked it, pushed it open, and entered the room that had been waiting for him. Maigret closed the door behind them. The room was unchanged, the bed narrow, the table scarred, the photograph still upon the sill. The air carried the same faint smell of kerosene, dust, and old tobacco. The man removed his hat, placed it carefully on the table, and sat in the chair as though reclaiming a throne of silence. For a long time neither spoke. Maigret filled his pipe, struck a match, and smoked with the patience of a man willing to let silence do its work. The tenant stared at the floor, his thin fingers resting on the table, tapping faintly as if in rhythm with some private tune. Finally Maigret exhaled and said softly, "Saint-Amand remembers you. So does Clément. They remember your silence, your debts, your waiting. They remember you more than men who stayed." The man's lips tightened, but still he did not speak. His eyes lifted briefly toward the photograph, then fell again. "You carry many names," Maigret continued. "Duval here, Lemoine there, always a room, always a corner in a café, always a glass of wine left unfinished, and always departure without farewell. Why?" The man's fingers tapped faster, then ceased. He raised his head at last, his voice quiet, hoarse, as though unused. Why does it matter? Maigret regarded him steadily. Because silence is never innocent. It disturbs more than words. Ask your neighbours. Ask your concierge. You do nothing, and yet the house listens to you as if to a thunderstorm. A flicker of something, weariness perhaps, crossed the man's face. He looked at Maigret with an expression both defiant and imploring. And if I told you I prefer silence to lies? Silence can be a lie, Maigret replied. The man looked away toward the suitcase beneath the bed. He drew it out slowly, opened it, and revealed the shirts, the scarf, the train ticket still unused. He touched them as though to remind himself of their presence. I was always leaving, he murmured, always. But the trains never seemed meant for me. And the photograph? Maigret asked, his gaze fixed on the woman's face upon the sill. The man's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. She waits, somewhere. Or perhaps she doesn't. Perhaps she has forgotten. But I kept her near, in case memory was all that remained. For a moment the silence that filled the room was different, less heavy, almost human. Maigret smoked, watching the man's thin hands tremble faintly as he folded the tickets, replaced them, closed the suitcase again. It was not confession in the ordinary sense. It was quieter, more fragile. A recognition rather than a revelation. You cannot live in silence forever, Maigret said. The man gave a faint, ironic smile. And yet here I am. They sat for a long while, the only sound the faint creak of the chair beneath the tenant, and the occasional puff of smoke from Maigret's pipe. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, blurring the light from the courtyard. The city murmured faintly beyond, indifferent. At last, Maigret rose, heavy and deliberate, and placed his hand on the door. You will stay tonight. Tomorrow perhaps we shall speak again, or perhaps not. But remember, silence speaks too, and it has already spoken to Paris. The tenant inclined his head, accepting the words without resistance. His eyes drifted back to the photograph, as though that alone anchored him. Maigret left the room, closing the door softly behind him. The concierge was waiting in the stairwell, breath quick, eyes sharp with questions. He shook his head slightly, and she fell silent. On the street, Maigret drew deeply from his pipe, exhaled into the fog, and stood for a moment in the glow of the lamp. It had been no confession, no outburst, no revelation. But it had been a confrontation nonetheless, quiet and human, between silence and the one man willing to listen to it. The case had not ended, but it had turned a corner. And Maigret, heavy and thoughtful, knew that silence, once confronted, could never again remain the same. The Seine ran slow that evening, swollen from the rain but still patient, its waters reflecting the dim yellow glow of the city's lamps, each one a fractured shard of light scattered across the surface. Maigret stood on the quay, staring at the flow of the river, his coat collar turned up against the cool breeze that carried with it the scent of damp stone and coal smoke. It was a quiet night, one of those nights when the city feels both vast and intimate, when it holds its breath as if waiting for something to break the stillness. He had walked the streets of Paris for hours, the weight of the case heavy on his shoulders, the silence of Rue des Martyrs still echoing in his mind. The tenant, and the man who had lived in so many places under so many names, had finally been faced with his own reflection. Not in confession, not in fear, but in quiet recognition. Maigret knew the case was not over. He knew better than to believe that. But something had shifted. Something had revealed itself in that small, dark room. Not the truth, not entirely, but a part of it. Maigret pulled his pipe from his coat pocket, struck a match, and lit it with the precision of habit. The smoke curled upward, twisting in the air like a wisp of memory. He had spent so many years in this city, chasing shadows, listening to the whispers of men and women who spoke in riddles and half-truths. But the tenant had given him something more than the usual evasions. In his quiet manner, in his silence, there had been a kind of honesty, one that spoke of fear, of grief, and of a life fractured by some unspoken loss. He had not learned the tenant's name, not truly, but he had learned enough to know that the man was not a criminal, not a political exile, not even the haunted figure the press had painted. He was simply a man whose life had broken into pieces too small to fit together. And Paris, with its noise, its endless movement, had allowed him to disappear into the folds of its anonymity. The fog thickened as he walked along the riverbank, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the mist. He passed a few scattered figures, all wrapped in their coats against the cold, their faces lost in the shadows. Paris at night was always like this, strange, quiet, as if everyone had retreated into their own thoughts, leaving only the city to observe. But Maigret knew that the city, like the river, never stayed the same. It was always changing, always moving, even if the surface appeared still. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the station house loomed before him, a dark silhouette against the sky. He ascended the stairs slowly, his hand still resting on the railing, and entered the building. Inside, the usual murmur of activity buzzed faintly, clerks sorting through papers, telegrams being sent, officers huddled in small groups, speaking in low voices. It was the steady hum of a place that never rested, a place where lives were judged and mysteries unravelled. But tonight, Maigret felt no urgency. The tenant had returned to his silence, and for now, so had he. Janvier was at his desk when Maigret entered, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up when Maigret approached, his expression shifting to something between curiosity and respect. "Well?" Maigret sat at his desk, carefully removing his hat and placing it on the table. He drew deeply from his pipe, watching the smoke swirl in the dim light. "He won't be leaving," he said quietly. Janvier blinked, clearly expecting more. "You've made an arrest?" Maigret shook his head. "No arrest, not yet. There's nothing to arrest him for. No crime committed, no law broken." "But you have what you need?" Janvier pressed, leaning forward slightly. Maigret looked at him, his eyes steady. "What I need isn't always what you think." He paused, drawing the last of his pipe smoke into his lungs before exhaling it slowly. "The tenant has been hiding in plain sight, in plain silence. He carries debts, yes. He carries a broken life, a history that's fractured, but he's no criminal." Janvier opened his mouth as if to protest, but Maigret raised a hand. "Not every silence is a crime, Janvier. Not every man who withdraws from the world is guilty of something. Sometimes a man is just too broken to speak." For a moment, there was quiet between them. Then Janvier nodded slowly, as if understanding the weight of Maigret's words. "So what happens now?" Maigret leaned back in his chair, his gaze turning toward the window. He could see the faint reflection of the street lamps on the water of the Seine, the fog swirling like smoke. The city was both alive and dead, its pulse faint yet steady, its heart beating in the shadows. "Now we wait," Maigret said. "We wait for him to decide whether he's ready to step out of his silence. If he does, we'll be here. If not, we'll let him be. He's no more dangerous than a man with nothing left to lose." Janvier looked as though he wanted to argue, but he held his tongue. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that Maigret's work was not always about capturing criminals. Sometimes it was about understanding the human frailty that led a man to hide, to withdraw, to disappear. Maigret had spent his life searching for the truth, but he knew that truth was often hidden in places where even the law could not go. A knock on the door interrupted the moment, and Lucas entered, his usual confident swagger slightly subdued. "Chief, there's something you should know." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Lucas hesitated for a moment, glancing between Maigret and Janvier. "The tenant, Duval, or whatever name he's using, he left something behind. We found it at the cafe where he's been spending most of his time. A letter, Chief. Unopened. It's addressed to him, but it wasn't sent. Not by post." Maigret stood, his interest piqued. "Where is it?" Lucas handed him a small envelope, simple, without a return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet the way it was placed on the table suggested an urgency Maigret hadn't anticipated. He studied it for a moment, then tore it open, unfolding the paper inside. The letter was brief, the handwriting sharp, but not hurried. "I know where you are. I know what you've done. You cannot hide forever. If you want your life back, come to me. I will be waiting." Maigret's brow furrowed. The letter was unsigned, the tone harsh, accusatory. Yet there was no return address, no name, only the cold certainty that whoever had written it knew more about the tenant than he had ever let on. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the letter. "This changes things," he muttered to himself. The silence wasn't enough for him to hide. Someone is still watching him, someone who knows the truth. Janvier spoke up. "What should we do now, Chief?" Maigret exhaled slowly, his thoughts turning over like a slow-moving tide. "We find who wrote this letter, and then we wait for the tenant to make his move. He won't stay hidden forever. No one can." Lucas nodded and exited the room, leaving Maigret and Janvier alone. Maigret stared out the window, the weight of the letter pressing on him. He had known all along that the tenant's story was only half told, that the silence was not the end but the beginning of something deeper. The river flowed by outside, its current strong, unyielding, just as the case would unfold now, slowly, but with increasing inevitability. The tenant's time in hiding was running out. And when he stepped into the light, whatever truth he was trying to escape would finally be revealed. Maigret leaned back in his chair, his pipe slowly dying in the ashtray. He had known this day would come, the moment when the river of silence would break and the flood of truth would carry everything with it. It had been a long time coming, but the river had its own way of deciding when things should change, and Maigret, as always, would follow it to the end.